ready to dive into a completely different take on performance management.
I'm all for it. Those annual performance reviews, they always feel kind of off, don't they?
Totally. And this time we're looking at the HBR Guide to Performance Management to get to the bottom of it.
Okay, so right off the bat, what's got my attention is how many companies are realizing those yearly reviews, they're like missing the mark.
Yeah, it's like instead of helping people grow, it just ends up being this big stressful thing.
Exactly. Like cramming for an exam you didn't even know you had.
Right. All the feedback just gets crammed into one stressful session instead of it being, a normal part of how we work.
It's like only getting directions at the very end of a road trip. You've probably taken some wrong turns by then, right?
Exactly. And speaking of wrong turns, the book talks about companies like, was it Netflix and GE?
Yeah, those were the ones.
Ditching this whole model in favor of more, I guess you could say, regular and informal check-ins.
Right, because it's more about that continuous feedback, right? You're adjusting your course in real time instead of realizing at the end of the year that you're totally lost.
Makes sense. So have you seen this shift happening in your own work at all?
Big time. The whole idea of continuous feedback, it's definitely gaining traction. People are understanding that it's just way more effective for actually improving performance.
It's like those SMART goals we're always hearing about, right?
Yeah, specific, measurable, achievable, all that jazz.
But the book makes a good point. Just because you check all those boxes doesn't mean the goal is actually, like, moving the team in the right direction.
Totally. There needs to be more to it than that, for sure. The HBR guide talks about how goals need to be connected to the company's overall strategy to be really effective.
So it's not just about hitting random targets.
Nope, not at all. Employees need to get it, like, how their individual work actually plays a part in the bigger picture, you know?
Right. It gives their work more meaning that way.
For sure. The book uses this example, I think was Gap? Yeah, Gap. They shifted away from those rigid annual goals to these shorter-term objectives.
Interesting.
And those objectives are much more aligned with, how their priorities are constantly evolving, especially in the fashion industry. Things move fast.
So it's all about being adaptable, being able to change direction quickly.
You got it.
Mm.
That's key in today's world, no question.
It's funny you should say that. I was reading about this tech company that completely changed how they do goal setting.
Oh, really? Tell me more.
They moved away from individual targets completely, and now they have these team-based, what they call impact goals.
Impact goals. I like that.
And these goals are directly linked to, like, the company's strategic priorities.
Oh, I see. So it's less about individual achievement and more about, like, collective impact.
Exactly. It's all about everyone pulling in the same direction.
And that actually ties into another point the book makes about flexibility, like holding on to goals that are, past their prime. That can really hurt a company.
Especially in those fast-changing industries, what's a top priority one day could be completely irrelevant the next.
Exactly. And it's not just about the goals themselves, but also the metrics we use to measure success,
Right. Like, how do we even know if we're moving in the right direction if we're measuring the wrong things?
Totally. The guide calls them missing metrics, these situations where we don't actually connect our goals to measurable results.
And then we end up wondering why things aren't improving.
It stresses picking metrics that actually reflect performance and, like, genuinely contribute to the bigger picture.
So it's about getting those metrics right from the get-go.
100%. Because what's that saying? What gets measured gets...
It gets managed.
Yeah.
But are we measuring the right things? That's the question.
Such a good point.
It reminds me of this one company. They were so focused on tracking, like, the number of customer service calls they were getting.
Okay.
But they completely missed the bigger picture. Their customer satisfaction was tanking because the actual service, the quality of it, was terrible.
So they were so busy managing the wrong metric that they almost
tanked the whole department.
That's a perfect example of what the HBR guide calls choosing the wrong metrics and how it can lead to, those unintended consequences that can really trip a company up.
It all backfires in the end.
Exactly. The guide really emphasizes the need to, like, step back and evaluate our metrics regularly.
Just to make sure they're still relevant, right?
Yeah, and that they're driving the results we actually want to see.
It does seem like picking the right metrics kind of goes hand in hand with this whole shift towards ongoing performance management, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. The book really hammers home this idea that performance management shouldn't be this, like, once-a-year fire drill,
More like a constant thing.
Exactly. It's about building a culture where feedback and improvement are just part of the flow, continuous.
Well, we're ditching the dreaded annual review. Yeah. Moving towards more regular check-ins.
Bingo. The HBR guide talks about how frequent check-ins help you catch those performance hiccups early on. But it's not just about, catching
It's
problems.
about acknowledging the wins too, right?
You got it. And providing those coaching moments that help people actually grow and develop their skills. It's like instead of one big evaluation, it becomes this regular rhythm of how teams work together.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, have you come across companies that are doing this really well? Like, how do they actually structure those conversations?
There's this software company the book mentions. They've gone all in on weekly check-ins. But here's the thing. They scrapped those typical status update meetings.
Really?
Yep. They replaced them with these more focused conversations, about what's blocking progress and what opportunities are out
More
there.
future-focused.
Exactly. And the HBR guide actually lists some killer questions to use in these check-ins. Stuff like, so what are you hoping to get done this week? And are there any roadblocks I can help you with? Simple, but effective.
I love that. It's less about, checking off boxes and more about having a real conversation about,
Yeah.
like, how do we move forward?
Right, and it feels more supportive, less like, someone's breathing down your neck all the time.
For sure. Now, the book also talks about documenting these conversations, right? Not in a, like, formal, scary way, I hope.
No, not at all. More like keeping a running tab of what was discussed, any feedback that was shared, and the action steps everyone agreed on.
So everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. Creates a clear record for everyone involved.
Less about judging and more about, like, building a roadmap for growth together.
100%.
Which actually, speaking of growth, the HBR guide gets into the nitty-gritty of giving and receiving feedback, which, let's be real, that's where things can go sideways if we're not careful, right?
Oh, big time. It's a minefield. One of the biggest takeaways for me was being specific.
None of that vague good jobs stuff.
Exactly, or that didn't quite hit the mark. The HBR guide is all about tying feedback to specific, observable behaviors.
And then offering, like, concrete suggestions for improvement, right?
You got it. So instead of saying, hey, your presentation fell kind of flat, you could say something like, I noticed you were reading from your notes a lot during that presentation. Have you thought about using more visuals to keep people engaged?
Oh, that's so much better.
Right. It's actionable. It
Yeah.
gives the person something concrete to work with. And the HBR guide really drives home this point. Feedback should always be about actions and behaviors, not about someone's personality.
Yeah, it's tough to take criticism when it feels personal.
Exactly. And when it's focused on things you can actually change and get better at, it just creates a more objective and less personal environment for these conversations.
Totally. But it's not just about, dishing it out, right? The HBR guide also talks about how important active listening is when you're on the receiving end of feedback.
Oh, absolutely. It's a two-way street for sure.
Asking questions, really trying to see things from the other person's perspective, and not getting defensive, which I'll admit can be a struggle sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
It's natural to want to jump in and defend yourself when you feel like you're being criticized,
I feel you. It's human nature. That's why the book talks about creating this culture where feedback is seen as a good thing, like a gift.
a chance to grow.
Exactly. Not some kind of personal attack.
And that takes a certain level of trust, I imagine.
Big time. You got to trust that the feedback is coming from the right place, that everyone's ultimately on the same team, working towards the same goals.
So we're talking about changing the mechanics of performance management, but also, like, the whole vibe, right?
Totally. Creating this environment where people feel psychologically safe, they feel comfortable sharing their thoughts, giving and receiving feedback, all without the fear of being judged or penalized for speaking their mind.
It's like we're not just managing performance, we're cultivating a culture of open and honest communication.
100%. And sometimes, feedback alone just doesn't cut it. That's where the HBR guide brings up coaching as this more in-depth way to support people.
Coaching.
Yeah, helping people level up their skills and really tackle those performance gaps.
Coaching seems like it's becoming more and more important these days.
For sure, especially with how quickly things are changing. People are feeling the pressure to keep up. But here's the thing. The HBR guide makes it clear that coaching shouldn't be a punishment.
Oh, absolutely not.
It's about providing the right support and guidance tailored to the individual to help them reach their full potential.
So it's not one size fits all.
Nope. It's about figuring out what works best for each person.
Whether it's mentorship or extra training or even just having someone to bounce ideas off of.
Totally. And it all circles back to that idea of intrinsic motivation, which is something the HBR guide talks about a lot.
It's not just about the external rewards like bonuses or promotions.
Right. It's about tapping into those internal drivers.
The things that make people feel valued, challenged, excited to come to work every day.
Exactly. And a lot of times that starts with creating a culture of respect.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It does seem like respect is kind of fundamental, wouldn't you say? Like, for any performance management system to really work, it has to start there.
You're absolutely right. The book actually makes a big deal about that, saying respect is non-negotiable.
It makes sense, right?
It's about building a workplace where everyone, regardless of their role, feels like they're valued, like their voice matters.
Heard, supported, not just a cog in the machine, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about feeling good either. The HBR guide even mentions some research showing that a lack of respect, whether it's blatant disrespect or just ignoring people,
Or even like subtle things, those little digs.
totally, it can actually hurt both morale and performance.
People don't do their best work when they feel like they're walking on eggshells, right?
Exactly. It can create this toxic environment that drives good people away.
It becomes this whole vicious cycle because then you're left with a team that's burnt out, checked out, and then they're more likely to keep that negative behavior going.
It's the opposite of what you're trying to create with a good performance management system.
For sure. It's counterproductive in the end.
And speaking of burnout, the HBR guide actually offers some really practical advice for preventing it.
Which is something that I think everyone's thinking about these days.
Right, burnout is everywhere.
It's a real epidemic.
And the guide really stresses how important it is to recognize those early warning signs.
Like what? What are some things to watch out for?
Well, cynicism's a big one. If someone who used to be really positive and engaged starts being really negative all the time.
That's not their usual self.
Exactly. And of course, exhaustion, that feeling of being completely drained all the time. Oh, and decreased productivity, that's another one.
So like if someone's output starts to slip, that's a sign that something might be up.
Could be. Those are all things that managers and leaders really need to be paying attention to.
Because it's not about pushing people to the brink.
Right. It's about creating a sustainable pace.
Right. An environment where people can actually do their best work without burning themselves out.
Exactly. The book talks about setting realistic workloads, encouraging people to take breaks, and allowing for flexibility in how and where people work.
Which again circles back to that whole respect thing, doesn't it?
It all connects.
Creating a culture where people feel comfortable setting boundaries, prioritizing their own well-being.
Totally. And it's on managers to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. Like if you're sending emails at all hours and expecting immediate responses.
You're sending the wrong message.
Exactly. You're not setting a healthy example.
Right. It's about creating a culture where people feel supported. Like it's okay to actually disconnect and recharge.
Because when they come back, they'll be more focused, more energized, and more productive in the long run.
Makes sense. Now, all of this gets even trickier when we're talking about managing remote teams, right? Which is something a lot of companies are grappling with these days.
Totally different ballgame. And the HBR guide actually dedicates a whole section to this.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It emphasizes that managing remote employees effectively, it really requires a shift in how we think about things.
Because you can't just take the same approach you would in an office and just, like, try to make it work remotely.
Right, exactly. The guide talks about the importance of crystal clear communication, frequent check-ins.
Even more so than usual.
Absolutely. And making a real effort to foster a sense of connection, of belonging, even when everyone's spread out geographically.
It's easy for remote workers to feel isolated.
It's so true. And the book suggests that managers really need to be proactive about, reaching out, checking in on how people are doing, both professionally and personally.
Making sure they feel seen and heard.
Yes. And trusted.
Trusted.
Like you trust them to manage their own time and workload effectively.
Ah, okay, I get you. So it's about outcomes, not just clocking in and out.
You got it. And providing that regular feedback.
Yeah.
Because you're not bumping into each other in the hallway or grabbing coffee together.
So you have to be more intentional about those interactions.
Exactly.
It's like finding that sweet spot between giving people the guidance they need, but also the autonomy to manage their own work and thrive.
Well said. And recognizing that managing remote teams well, it takes a special set of skills.
For sure. You have to be adaptable and willing to try new things.
100%. Because the way we work is changing, and we've got to change with it.
Well said. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the HBR Guide to Performance Management, I think the biggest takeaway for our listeners is that it's time to ditch those old school one-size-fits-all models and embrace a more human approach, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's about seeing our colleagues, our teammates as people first.
Recognizing that they have lives and families and dreams and aspirations outside of work.
Exactly. And that when we create a workplace where people feel valued and respected and empowered, everybody wins.
They do their best work, they're more engaged, they stick around longer.
It's a win-win. The HBR guide, it really lays out a practical, actionable framework for creating that kind of environment.
Yeah, it's a great reminder that performance management isn't just about hitting those numbers. It's about creating a culture where everyone can thrive.
I'm so glad we did this deep dive. It's given me a lot to think about.
Me too. And hopefully it's given our listeners a lot to think about as well. Until next time, everybody, keep learning and keep growing.